So welcome to the first Afterthoughts episode of season 3 of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm joined with the co-hosts who have been thinking about the bad things they said in the original episodes. That is Dr. Lee Johnson. How are you, Lee?
I'm doing pretty good.
And Dr. Charles Peterson. How are you, Charles?
I'm doing okay.
And Rick Lee is joining us from Poland again.
And I'm your host,
right.
Rick Lee, joining you from Poland, where travel
he's
is
trying to avoid Omicron.
Right, right, because we are the podcast international.
Yeah, although in Polish it's Omicron.
Oh, I see the nuance in that.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So afterward is Whose History. Charles, do you have any afterthoughts about our Whose History episode?
I think that was just such an amazing, all the episodes are amazing, but this was so brilliant. I think it was just a great way to start off the new season. I want to thank Professor Charles Mckinney once again for spending some time with us, just mind-blowing in terms of the questions and the insights that he provided. There's always something I think that could be said, but I certainly want to reiterate how important this question is now at this particular moment in American history, right? As we find sort of the right wing trying to sort of take control of the future by reshaping the past, right? And we can begin to see the importance of having an open, inclusive, and expansive approach to history, right? Because hopefully one day we will learn from histories and no longer make those same mistakes. And it seems that the right wants us to continue to make the same mistakes. So I think that episode is more important in many ways than a lot of the things that we talk about, because of just the political and the social and the historical imperative of it at this point.
Yeah,
for sure. Lee, what have you been thinking about in terms of that episode?
Well, I also want to give a shout out to Chuck Mckinney. He was just an absolutely great guest. And we Chuck, you open invitation to come back and talk about anything you want next time. I do have to say that, I'm sad to report that the brouhaha about critical race theory is still going on. It's not something that blew over, despite the wide impact and influence of this podcast. It's still happening.
It's still brouhaha.
It's still brouhaha and its ass off. Yes. But I will say one thing that I in the last few days have been thinking a lot about in relation to that conversation, which is that the right is playing a long game with restructuring things like school education. And so we're recording this today, waiting to hear what the Supreme Court is going to decide about Roe v. Wade. So yesterday, the arguments were made about Roe v. Wade. I assume that tomorrow or later today, maybe we'll hear what the judgment is. I don't think it's looking very good right now. I think this is a truly terrifying development in the judicial system. But of course, this was a long time coming, right? The right has been building this Supreme Court for 20 years. And it made me think that, we've really got to be more aggressive in opposing. We can't just look away when they do things like say we're going to ban critical race theory, because that's just one step in a much larger program. And if we don't nip it in the bud, as Barney Fife used to say, we are going to find ourselves ruining much more significant decisions further down the road. So what about you, Ray?
I just let me reiterate, Chuck Mckinney is welcome on this podcast at any time. It was in addition to his incredible insights, he just slipped right into the bar, bellied up, and got it going with us. And it was both really interesting and a lot of fun. I heard recently an interview with Nicole Hannah-Jones, the original person behind the 1619 Project. And, she reiterated a lot of things that came up during that episode and a lot of the issues that Chuck brought up. But one thing I've been thinking about, and this is not in relation necessarily to that episode, but the larger issue is a number of right-wing journalists, in quotes, have been talking about the problem with educating students about race is that it makes white students feel bad. And I think that what the lesson Charles was teaching us is that, feeling bad or not feeling bad is entirely beside the point.
Right.
It's not the issue here. And if you feel bad, maybe good for you. Maybe that shows some kind of moral sensibility or so on. But that's not the point here. The point here is to start getting actual facts taught in ways that up until now they haven't been taught. And to get people to realize the importance of unmarked signifiers. That is that a lot of history, if it just is called history, is white history. But you don't have to mark that because that's just the universal position. And I think Chuck was really great in challenging that and bringing to attention how much richer our understanding of ourselves, the past, would be if we start asking this question, whose history?
Yeah.
I think, and certainly what's a challenge for me, and I'm an academic by training and this is my career, the idea, right, and I think this is at the heart of this conversation, the idea that once introduced to a particular sort of framework or an understanding or events or data, then that will sort of create and open up these possibilities of rethinking the world and how people fit into it and how the world can be organized, right? That's it. Once people know better, they do better. My real concern, and if we're talking about the ways in which the right wing has this sort of 50, 60-year plan, really, if we go back to sort of the 60s and the realignment ideologically of the major political parties. My real concern is that they don't care. It's not a question of, oh, we don't know, we're ignorant to these facts, right? And if we were aware, then we would sort of behave in very different ways. My concern is they don't care.
Yeah.
Right. And it doesn't matter what you tell them. It doesn't matter how many books that are rebridges or how many times you listen to King's sort of Riverside Church speech, or how many times we sort of revisit Jesse Jackson's 1984, 1988 run. None of that matters, right? Because ultimately this is not an epistemic, right, sort of battle. Ultimately, this is a political, cultural, civilizational battle that we're engaged in.
Yeah. So what about, did you want to say something else about?
No, I was just going to do what you were doing. So
go ahead. Well, let's talk about the second episode. So the second episode was on American Christianity. It occurred to me, I just want to say, it occurred to me after we published this episode that I should have put like American in quotes, because I think that's really what was at issue in our conversation was, is there an American version of Christianity? But what about you? So what do you guys think? Afterthoughts.
Well, I initially, as we were recording the episode and talking about it, I was kind of bristling at the identification of American Christianity with a kind of right-wing, evangelical, racist version of Christianity. But as I think, Lee, you were just pointing out, is what we were trying to get at is, okay, yeah, we all know there's Christianity, and that's been a long game. That's the longest of long cons. And so that's been going on, but what is the specifically American contribution? And I think we got to that. The one thing I wish I had talked more about centrally in the conversation was the fairly recent and pretty rapid move of American Catholicism to the right. And there was a recent survey, I'm sorry, I forget who did it, of priests in the United States, and they've noted in that survey a marked shift of younger priests toward the right. And so I think that's an important issue as well, because we used to be able to rely on a kind of social justice, Dorothy Day kind of Catholicism that I think these days exists in smaller and smaller pockets.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point, and I did want to address that. And it seems to me that there's, for lack of a better term, an evangelification of American Catholicism. You know, much like if we think about liberation theology from the 60s and 70s, right, becoming a major voice for Catholicism in South America, but by the 80s, you begin to see the rise of a certain type of evangelical Protestantism, right, which is, and certainly connected to the right return of so many South American governments in that historical moment. And we can see the same sort of thing taking place within the United States, right? A religion that sort of appeals to really people's worst instincts versus to their highest aspirations. I think that's a great point, Rick. And it's one that I wish I had made while we were having the conversation.
Yeah, I suppose I wish that we had talked just a little bit more about how so much of right-wing politics is happening in the pulpit, in the congregation. You guys have probably seen the video clips of this church. I don't remember where it was, where the congregation is chanting, "Let's go, Brandon,"
Right.
you know, and I saw that, and my immediate reaction was, well, isn't this America? Ain't that America? Right? I mean, it sounds like they're at a football game, I mean, it's like sports, religion, and politics, like all right there in the pews. And I suppose, I think that in our podcast episode, I came off sounding sort of the most critical of American Christianity. And I think that clip kind of captures what I'm thinking about as American Christianity. I don't imagine, I mean, I don't know, but I can't imagine that you would see that kind of a phenomenon in a Christian church anywhere else in the world.
And how unchristian is it? I mean, if you look at the origin of the chant, "Let's go, Brandon," how unchristian is it to drop the F-bomb in the middle of church?
Well,
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're right. I like the idea of this sort of chauvinistic spectacle that religion has become, and even to the point of just the spatial sort of sense of it in these mega churches, in these huge stadiums, which no longer have the intimacy and the recognition of an individual humanity that one thinks of as being historic. Certainly the early church, the recognition of the specialness of each individual's subjective sort of identity. But now you have this sort of massification. Now you have these broad sort of appeals that sort of flatten out, right, what we would think about as the human personality. And only in America can this sort of thing happen. Right.
We have this mega church on the, kind of the edge of the suburbs between, in Memphis, and it has these 3 crosses that I'm pretty sure you can see from space. They're massive. Often in Memphis, people call it Fort Jesus or Six Flags Over Jesus. It's just massive. But I used to be in a program at my previous institution where we would take students for a week on a kind of crash course in Memphis. And one of the days was on religion. And we, took them to synagogue, we took them to a church, we took them to a Buddhist temple, et cetera, but this was a church that we went to. And I had never been in a mega church. That's not the kind of church that I grew up in. And I distinctly remember the first time that I walked into the lobby of that church, which, by the way, looks like a mall, but that the first thing that I saw was an ATM in the lobby of the church. And I thought, I mean, I think I said in the episode, like, steer clear of churches with gymnasiums, but I also want to say steer clear of churches with ATMs in the lobby.
Right.
So then the last episode that we're talking about is the thought experiments episode. So I'm going to go first to Charles then, since Lee seems so giddy about it. Charles, do you have any afterthoughts about that episode?
I actually wish that the episode had gone longer. I found I found the conversations really intriguing. I'm not really into thought experiments, consciously so, right? I'm more of giving an example type of person in my teaching, but I like the way that we were able to explore the expansive possibilities of this, right? How do we sort of think about, how do we sharpen particular sort of intellectual and critical and ethical sort of blades within our minds using this form of pedagogy?
Lee, what about you?
I mean, I loved that episode, but I love thought experiments. I could talk about thought experiments all day. I think that, I suppose maybe one thing that we maybe didn't articulate clearly, which is something that I do want to say, is that I do think that a lot of people have this idea of philosophers as kind of, navel gazing, armchair, separated from the real world, kind of thinkers, and thought experiments is one of the things that they point to when they say that. They say like that's not the real world, and of course it isn't, but that is an important way to think about how you're going to think about the real world. And again, I think that thought experiments are very, very useful for sharpening and refining one's thinking. I also want to say that I was talking to a friend of mine who listened to the episode, and she said, I'm surprised that you didn't talk about America, the thought experiment. And at first I was like, what are you talking about? But as she was explaining, Barack Obama really famously was always saying, like, America is an experiment, right? Right. And it's the sort of working out of these ideals, to form a more perfect union, et cetera. But I'm not sure that I'm 100% on board that America is a thought experiment, but I do like the idea of thinking about it that way.
I think your friend is onto something. I think sort of the utopian sort of wishes of the early settlers, however you want to think about utopia, but that's what they wanted. They were trying to escape to someplace that could be a new type of society that could be constructed beyond sort of the limits of their previous sort of Western European existences. So I think in that sense, it is a thought experiment. Like, what are the elements? What type of government? Imagine if you had this blank, quote unquote, blank continent upon which to enact sort of an ideal sense of the perfect reality. So I think that's a very good point. It's a social experiment. I mean, to paraphrase Cornel West, it's a failed social experiment, but certainly I think it's a thought experiment as well.
Yeah.
It's interesting because, often I'm sure we've all heard this, that students might say, especially if you're teaching ethics or political theory, students will often say, well, that's a great theory, but it would never work in practice. And often the answer to that should be, well, so much the worse for practice.
Yeah. Right.
Change your practices.
Yeah, exactly. Like, let's change the world so that it does live up to these ideals. Go ahead, Charles.
A final point, and I hate this because a lot of things occur to me now. What would have been interesting to explore is how thought experiments work in other endeavors, not just in philosophy, of course, but let's say in the military. War games are thought experiments, in a sense, right? It's an imagining various possibilities and thinking through how one behaves within certain circumstances. So it'd be interesting to see what other sort of fields or endeavors sort of utilize thought experiments within the context of their goals.
Mm-hmm. And I think also we need to point out that as much as it seemed like I was, and maybe Charles a little bit too, kind of doggedly on this, listeners, just listen to all the subsequent episodes and see how much either I or Charles use thought experiments.
Right.
That's how I get them. That's how I get them.
We need a sound, right? Whenever we enter into a thought experiment, ding.
Yeah, I just sprinkle a little crack in an episode and then watch.
They have entered the clean room.
Oh, yeah. I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I will honestly say that one of my favorite things about that episode is this phrase that Charles used where he talked about the clean room of thought. I have just started using that in my regular, interactions with people. I'm assuming everyone listens to our podcast, so they know what I'm talking about. But
I mean, you certainly have your
just such a
9 billion
great thought.
listeners on Twitter, so I'm sure we're getting some of that.
But Charles, only 8 billion of those are bots. She only has 1 billion followers.
That's true. My apologies. But yeah, well, I'm glad to contribute something to the philosophical lexicon.
This was for the next afterthoughts, but your now I can't remember, absolutist discursive state is another thing you can.
Oh yeah,
that's coming up in a couple of episodes. Listeners, hang around.
That'll be fun. Yeah.
One thing I learned is how to drop a hint for the future. Any afterthoughts before we wrap this up?
No, I think these were really a good, strong start to season 3. I'm really glad that we're back in this. I think we got a lot of really cool things coming up this season. So I'm looking forward to all of them.
Oh yeah, most definitely. I'm looking forward to the next afterthoughts. I think we've got the next 3 episodes are pretty meaty. So I think we're gonna have a good meal. and then the burping afterwards, because this is really, if we're gonna use the metaphor of the meal, then this is really sort of like the indigestion.
Well, I think that's a good note to leave it on. The next Afterthoughts episode will come after the next 3 episodes, but in the meantime, go to our website, hotelbarpodcast.com. That's hotelbarpodcast.com, and listen to the subsequent episodes and join us here again in a few weeks. Thank you. See you all later.
Bye, guys. I'll see you next time.
Bye.